Second part is about second culture acquisition and social distance. Second culture acquisition, we have lately discussed second language acquisition, and now it is second culture acquisition, which is accompanied by the second language acquisition is accompanied by a second cultural acquisition, and these are the findings given by a number of researchers, including Hammer, Blanc, Schumann especially. It refers to the notion that a learner's acquisition of communicative competence, that the ability to communicate in any language, must also involve acquiring of new cultural knowledge, and that new cultural knowledge is basically the knowledge about the values and customs of other language. So it is not simply acquiring of the second language when a learner is in that process. It is also about acquiring of the knowledge about values, norms, and beliefs of the new culture as well. Robinson, Stott, and Nocken suggested that language learners undergo culture learning as a process that is as a way of perceiving, interpreting feelings, being in the world, and relating to where one is and who one meets. So basically, it's not just the language. When the learner is undergoing this process of learning a new language, the process involves how you perceive, how you interpret, how you feel about where you are, in which situation you are, and to whom you are in a process of interaction or communication. Schumann has suggested 4 stages of culture acquisition. The first stage is a period of excitement and euphoria over the newness of surroundings. This period of excitement and euphoria comes from the learner being in a new surrounding, and he or she simply goes through this immense feeling or intense feeling of happiness and excitement when he or she is faced with a new surrounding. So this is called first stage or first period. The second is cultural shock. Now this stage emerges as individuals feel the intrusion of more and more cultural differences into their own. So intrusion or intruding of cultural differences into their own image of self and security. So here the clash of identity happens, and one gets a cultural shock by being or having the difficulties in absorbing himself or herself in new culture. The third stage is the one which is gradual and at first tentative and vacillating recovery. Vacillating is indecisive recovery. This stage is typified by what Larson and Semley called culture stress. Now, culture stress is a stress one goes through every day in terms of coping up with the new values of culture and staying ahead of people. So this is the third stage, which is gradual. And it is also known as acculturation stage, where a learner is going through a period of absorbing new culture and leaving some of his or her culture's features. And this leads to some type of causing huge problem, where some problems are solved while some continue to exist. Stage 4 represents near or full recovery, either assimilation or adaptation and acceptance. We all have discussed assimilation in detail, that it's a process of absorbing new information and then adopting and then acceptance of new culture and self-confidence in new person that has developed in this culture. So basically, the new identity has been achieved at this stage, and a person or a learner feels comfortable by assimilating and adapting and accepting the norms of the new culture. According to Ledicott, Papadimeter, Sicarni, and Colruyt, learning to communicate in an additional language involves developing an awareness of the ways in which culture interrelates with language whenever it is used. Social distance. Social distance refers to the cognitive and affective proximity of two cultures that come into contact within an individual. So proximity is basically closeness and nearness in terms of how closely one thinks and how closely one feels. So cognitive and affective domain. But then we are also dealing with social distance. So distance here is used metaphorically, which refers to basically dissimilarities. So we have dissimilarities, and then within those dissimilarities, we are looking at the proximity of cognition as well as affective domain when these two cultures come into contact within one individual. Wallace Lambert says that on his study on attitude refers to Durkheim's concept of anomie, which is feelings of social uncertainty or dissatisfaction, as a significant aspect of relationship between language learning and attitude towards the foreign culture. So basically, anomie is the feeling of social uncertainty, and this is the third stage of Schumann is also the same, where once you are exposed to the new culture, the feeling of uncertainty that how much is or how much of one's own culture has to be dropped off in order to acquire the second language acquisition, and as well as the second culture acquisition process is concerned. So this feeling of social uncertainty plays immensely a role that is quite effective in terms of determining or causing or bringing about similarities with each other in terms of two different cultures. Acculturation process or acculturation theory has been introduced by Schumann, which has social factors as well as psychological factors. Let's discuss the social factors as well as the psychological factors of Schumann theory of acculturation. So with regard to social distance, this says as if they feel that the target language and culture is more or less prestigious or dominant over their own. So that social distance based on the social aspect refers to the social status of the other cultures, the status in terms of how that culture is dominant or not dominant or subordinate. Now this particular aspect or the sense of prestige related to the status is very important when we are looking at the social distance. If their living conditions allow them to be integrated, the second is the integration, where the living conditions are making the process easy or the living conditions are facilitating the integration process of one language in the another culture. If they are living or intend to live in the target, so that's permanence, the duration of target learner's culture, and in which the learner or the second language learner is residing or is present, duration in which that learning takes place is what we here discuss as under the social distance. If there is a social congruence between the source and target language and culture. Now looking at the psychological distance, if they feel that they have or haven't control over new environment, so psychological barriers are constructed when you have a feeling that whether you have a control over the environment in which you find yourself, and also the process of integration, that how easily one can integrate the social aspects of one culture in the another. If their initial experience was to undergo a cultural shock, so if there's a cultural shock, it's going to demotivate and it's going to hinder the process of acculturation. If they feel that no matter what type of attempt they make, they are unable to understand or convey their meaning in the target language. So this is inability and also causes a huge psychological barrier where there is an uncertainty, and this is what we refer to as anomie, where there is an uncertainty whether how much effort they are making, whether they are going to make a difference or not. And last point is if they feel that the meanings that they convey are undervalued. So this is also in some manner related to the social status of the target language. To further simplify, these are the social distance parameters suggested by Schumann. The first one is dominance, that in terms of the status, whether the target language is dominant, not dominant, or subordinate. Integration, looking at the integration pattern in terms of assimilation and acculturation or preservation. Then you have cohesiveness, that refers to the size of second language group. The larger the size, the more difficult it is to get assimilated. So basically small size is more favorable. Congruence in terms of similarities of values and beliefs in second language group, their attitude towards each other. So that is what we mean by congruence. Then you have permanence, that is the length of residence in the target language. So these are these social distance parameters suggested by Schumann in his theory of acculturation. To conclude, second culture acquisition refers to the process of creating shared meaning between cultural representatives, and that leads to acculturation. Social distance basically refers to the notion that the greater the social distance between two groups, the more difficult it is for the members of the second language group to acquire the language of the target language group.